When people hear about a major security incident, the story often sounds dramatic and mysterious, as if attackers must have used some genius trick that nobody could stop. In reality, many high-impact incidents become possible because one fragile thing was allowed to matter too much. And once that one thing broke, everything else fell over like dominoes. That fragile thing is what we call a single point of failure, and it can be a server, a network path, a shared credential, a lone administrator account, a single approval step, or even one person who holds all the knowledge. In this lesson, we are going to build a clear mental picture of what single points of failure are, why they create both reliability problems and security problems, and how engineers and security professionals spot them early enough to fix them quietly. The goal is not to turn you into a hardware architect overnight, but to help you think like someone who notices hidden dependencies before they turn into an outage, a breach, or a headline that makes everyone ask how this was ever considered acceptable. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to separate the idea of failure from the idea of attack, because the same weakness often supports both. A failure can be accidental, like a disk dying, a network switch rebooting, or a cloud region having a service disruption. But the impact can look identical to an intentional act if it takes a critical function offline. An attack is intentional, but attackers frequently choose paths that resemble normal failures, because those paths are easier to exploit and harder to distinguish from bad luck. A single point of failure exists when one component, one control, or one dependency becomes a required gateway for availability, integrity, or confidentiality, meaning if it stops working or gets compromised, the system cannot continue safely. Beginners sometimes assume this only applies to uptime, but in security engineering it also applies to trust. If one certificate authority, one secrets vault, one identity provider, or one logging pipeline becomes the only way you can prove who did what, then the security story collapses when that one thing is unavailable or untrustworthy. To see why this matters, imagine a system as a chain of promises. The system promises it can identify users correctly, enforce rules, protect data, and keep operating long enough to be useful. Each promise depends on smaller promises, like a database being reachable, a time source being accurate, or an administrator being able to recover an account. A single point of failure is the place where many promises depend on one smaller promise. So the risk is not just that something breaks, but that many protections break at the same time. That is why headlines happen. The failure is rarely small, because the system design concentrated too much impact into one place. In a healthy design, failures still occur, but they stay local, meaning only a limited feature degrades and the rest continues in a controlled way. When engineers talk about resilience, they mean the ability to keep delivering the essential promises even when parts of the system are degraded, and eliminating single points of failure is a major way to make resilience real instead of aspirational. It also helps to understand that single points of failure often hide in places people do not label as components. A policy can be a single point of failure when only one person can approve access, and the organization has no backup when that person is unavailable, leading to rushed decisions or workarounds that bypass controls. A manual process step can be a single point of failure when the system cannot be restored without a specific sequence of actions that only one team knows. A shared spreadsheet of passwords, a lone jump box, or a single network segment that everything must traverse can all become choke points. Even a single monitoring tool can be a single point of failure if the organization relies on it as the only source of detection and evidence. The key idea is that a single point of failure is about dependency concentration, not about whether the thing is physical or digital. When you learn to look for dependency concentration, you begin to see the system in terms of critical paths and bottlenecks, which is exactly the perspective security engineering needs. One common misconception is that redundancy automatically solves the problem, as if simply having two of something means the risk is gone. Redundancy can reduce the chance of an outage, but it does not always reduce the chance of compromise, and sometimes it creates new ways to fail if both copies share the same weakness. If you have two servers, but they run the same vulnerable software version, then an attacker can compromise both in the same way, sometimes faster than a human can respond. If you have two network links, but they terminate on the same provider and the same upstream routing, then a single provider incident can still knock you off the internet. If you have multiple administrators, but they all use the same shared credentials, then compromise of the credential remains the single point of failure, even if many people hold it. Real resilience requires diversity and separation as well as redundancy, because the goal is not only to avoid random failures, but also to avoid shared mode failures where one cause takes down multiple defenses at once. To identify single points of failure, you first need to decide what must keep working for the system to be considered safe enough. That sounds abstract, but it is really about defining the essential mission of the system. For a payment system, it might be the ability to authorize transactions correctly and record them reliably. For a healthcare system, it might be the ability to retrieve patient records with integrity and maintain privacy. Once you know the essential mission, you can trace the critical path that supports it, asking what the system absolutely depends on at each step. When you trace that path, you look for nodes where many paths converge, because converging paths are where single points of failure tend to live. You also look for points where trust decisions are made, such as authentication, authorization, key management, and audit logging, because those are places where compromise can have outsized impact. This kind of tracing is less about memorizing diagrams and more about training your brain to ask, what happens if this one thing is wrong, missing, or hostile? Identity and access management is one of the most frequent places where security single points of failure appear, especially in systems that grow quickly. If one identity provider is the only way to authenticate, then an outage locks out legitimate users and may also block security responders from accessing tools during an emergency. If one privileged account can change all permissions, then compromise of that account can instantly become full control of the system. Even if the account is well protected, it is still a tempting target, and attackers love targets where one win equals the entire game. Eliminating the single point of failure in identity is not always about adding more identity providers, because that can be complex and risky. Often it is about designing safe fallback paths, limiting the blast radius of privileged access, requiring multiple independent approvals for high-impact changes, and ensuring recovery procedures are tested and not dependent on one person's memory. The guiding idea is to avoid any situation where one account, one token, or one service becomes the only gatekeeper for both normal operations and emergency response. Another major category is data storage and the services that support it, because data is usually the reason a system exists. If all data lives on one database instance with no replication, then failure can cause downtime and potentially data loss, and rushed recovery can lead to integrity mistakes that are hard to detect later. From a security perspective, a single database instance can also become the single point of compromise if it holds everything in one place and the controls around it are weak. Even with replication, the single point of failure can be the schema design, the key management method, or the way backups are handled. If the system relies on one encryption key for all data, then loss of that key is catastrophic, and compromise of that key is equally catastrophic. If backups exist but are stored in a place reachable with the same administrative credentials as production, then ransomware can target both production and backup simultaneously, turning the backup plan into a false sense of safety. Reducing single points of failure around data involves thinking about availability, integrity, and confidentiality together, not as separate checkboxes. Network design can hide single points of failure in ways that are easy for beginners to miss because networks feel like invisible plumbing. A single firewall, a single router, or a single domain name service can be a single point of failure for reachability. But the more subtle failures involve trust and segmentation. If all sensitive systems share one flat network, then one compromised endpoint becomes a path to everything else, and the network effectively becomes a single point of failure for containment. If a single remote access path is used by all administrators, and that path is compromised or unavailable, the organization may either lose the ability to respond or be tempted to create risky emergency workarounds. Good designs aim for multiple safe paths, not multiple unsafe paths, and they aim for segmentation that prevents one network foothold from turning into full internal access. The headline risk is often not that a router fails, but that one network choke point controls both normal traffic and monitoring traffic, and when it fails, defenders lose visibility at the exact moment they need it most. Software and application architecture also creates single points of failure, especially when a system relies on one central service for everything. A monolithic application can be efficient to build early on, but it can also mean that one bug, one misconfiguration, or one dependency outage takes down all functionality at once. In security terms, it can mean that one injection point or one authorization flaw becomes access to everything the application can reach. Even in distributed systems, the single point of failure can be a shared message queue, a central configuration service, or a single set of shared secrets that every service uses. Beginners sometimes think the problem only exists when there is literally one server, but the more accurate view is that the single point of failure is wherever control and dependency are centralized without adequate isolation. A resilient architecture tries to make failure a normal condition that the system can tolerate, and it tries to ensure that compromise of one piece does not automatically unlock all the others. When you design for containment, you lower both operational risk and security risk at the same time. Human and organizational single points of failure might be the most common in real life, even though they are rarely represented on technical diagrams. If only one person understands the system, then that person becomes the bottleneck for change, recovery, and incident response, and stress can push decisions toward shortcuts. If only one team has access to a critical administrative interface, then other teams might build shadow processes to get work done, which can create uncontrolled access paths. If the organization depends on one vendor support contact, one contract renewal, or one undocumented integration, then the system can become fragile in slow motion, failing not through an outage but through an inability to maintain security over time. Security engineering includes designing processes that are repeatable and teachable, because repeatable processes reduce the chance that the system depends on heroics. When you eliminate a human single point of failure, you often improve security culture because people stop needing to improvise under pressure. That reduces mistakes, and it makes the system easier to defend because fewer emergency exceptions are created. Now consider monitoring and incident response, because visibility is a kind of safety net, and a safety net can also have a single point of failure. If logs are only stored locally on the systems that generate them, an attacker who compromises a system can erase evidence and operate with less fear of detection. If all logs are sent to one centralized log collector and that collector fails, you can lose the timeline you need to understand what happened, which delays containment and recovery. If alerts depend on one correlation rule set, and that rule set is misconfigured, you might miss the early signs of an attack. Resilient monitoring often includes multiple layers of evidence, such as redundant log paths, immutable storage for critical records, and independent ways to validate the time sequence of events. The goal is not to record everything everywhere, but to avoid having exactly one fragile place where truth lives. When truth becomes fragile, attackers gain power, because they can shape what defenders believe. Reducing single points of failure is also about being realistic with trade-offs, because you cannot make everything redundant and isolated without cost or complexity. The art is deciding where the impact of failure is unacceptable and investing there first. A helpful mental trick is to think in terms of consequences. What happens if this fails, and what happens if this is compromised? If either answer is that the mission stops completely, data is lost, or trust is destroyed, then you are looking at a candidate's single point of failure. You then ask what it would take to reduce the impact, which might mean creating a backup capability, creating a manual safe mode operation, limiting permissions, adding separation, or designing a recovery plan that does not depend on one hidden detail. Importantly, the fix should reduce impact rather than only reducing likelihood, because even rare failures eventually occur, and attackers only need one success. The best improvements often come from simple design decisions made early, because early decisions shape where dependency concentration forms. A final piece to understand is how single points of failure become headlines specifically, because headlines are as much about narrative as they are about technical root causes. Incidents become news when the impact is broad, the downtime is long, the data loss is large, or the organization appears unprepared. A single point of failure creates exactly those conditions by allowing a small initial problem to cascade into a large visible outcome. Attackers also know this, which is why they target identity systems, backups, domain name systems, and privileged access paths, because those are places where they can cause maximum disruption quickly. When you remove those choke points, you change the attacker's cost-benefit calculation, forcing them to take slower and noisier paths that are easier to detect and contain. You also make normal operational hiccups less dramatic, because they turn into minor degradations rather than full outages. That is the quiet success story security engineering aims for. Fewer dramatic failures, fewer emergency workarounds, and fewer moments where everyone is asking why there was no backup plan. By the time you reach the end of this discussion, the most important takeaway is that eliminating single points of failure is not a one-time project or a fancy architecture diagram, but a habit of thinking about dependencies and impact. The systems that avoid incident headlines are rarely the ones that never fail, because failure is a natural part of technology, but they are the ones that fail in small, contained ways and recover predictably. When you learn to look for concentrated trust, centralized control, and hidden bottlenecks, you can spot the places where one mistake or one compromise would matter too much. From there, you can advocate for designs that include safe fallbacks, controlled recovery, separation of high-impact powers, and resilient visibility, all without needing to become an expert in any one tool. If you keep that mindset, you will start to see security as a form of engineering discipline that values graceful degradation and limited blast radius, rather than as a collection of last-minute patches and reactive rules. And that shift is exactly what helps teams move from repeatedly reacting to headlines to quietly preventing them in the first place.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.